Very first one is we're very excited to have Dame Fiona Murray, professor at MIT and the vice chair of the NATO Innovation Fund, sitting down with Dr. Tobias Stone for a chat about innovation and how ecosystems can develop and support national security and defense. Give them a round of applause and bring them on out.
Well, thank you for being here, Fiona. We're going to dive straight in. I was saying to you, I was in Estonia recently, and I met a great Ukrainian founder with a drone that's battle-tested, funded, and ready to go, but he told me he couldn't find the capacity to build it at scale. Yep. And you've been writing recently about how the emergence of drone warfare should be an industrial wake-up call, and that we've lost the battle for drones. So would you like to expand on that, please?
Yes, so I don't think we've lost the battle for drones per se, but I think if you actually looked, if you put a drone on an operating table and you said, all right, what are the main components or subsystems, you'd find that there were about a dozen of those subsystems. And if you asked yourself, who are the top 3 producers of those subsystems that I would need to talk to and go and buy those from, you would find that every single one of them was in China. Now, you might ask yourself, well, all right, well, perhaps that's where they were invented, so that seems an inevitable part of the industrial history of drones and so on. But in fact, when you trace the history back, the invention, the early stage commercialization was all done in the United States, UK, and Europe. And so what it tells us is that while we are often extraordinarily good at invention and generating the first of something, one of something, and we can be very good at deploying these things, we have this missing middle, which is the fact that we don't actually produce at scale, and so we've lost control, I think, of our industrial base for some extremely important things.
And the missing middle is something you also refer to with capital, that allows us to produce things at scale?
Yes, so I think, and we've heard a little bit about that from our previous speakers, which is, I think that particularly in the United States, we're extremely good at funding the early stage of idea generation, commercialization, even getting to sort of high levels of technology readiness. We're getting better at that in the UK, we're getting better at that in Europe. But our capacity to deploy capital into the capital assets, into production, into things that are actually expensive, that put a lot of capital at risk. Traditional financing mechanisms, things like project finance that you'd normally use, don't like the risk of new things. And so we risk having this sort of capital gap, this missing middle. And traditionally what we've said is, look, who cares? We're going to produce somewhere else. We're going to do the lowest cost production. And that lowest cost production has typically been done in China. And so we've said, all right, well, let some other ecosystem do that. They'll get good at it. And it won't matter, because anytime we want something, we'll just buy it. But we saw through the pandemic, we've seen through the war in Ukraine, that these systems, these supply chains get completely disrupted, either deliberately or by chance. And
we'll dig into this more, but on the capital bits, what do we need to do to address this? Does it need different types of capital, or what's the solution?
So I think there are 2 things. So we definitely need new capital structures that fill some of this gap. So we need to be able to think about how to deploy capital into production. We need to understand new forms of project financing. We need some types of debt financing. And we need to have that debt financing be acceptable whether we're making things that, when we're doing things that are dual use. So things that can be used for defense purposes and things that can be used in massive civilian markets. And I think at the moment, there's quite a lot of discomfort out there. If you say, well, we're making something for defense, sometimes it's hard to even open a bank account, let alone actually get a loan to build a factory. And so we need to think about those capital structures. We need to tap into low-cost production, but probably across the alliance. And I think the other piece, and again, this is why the venture capital piece is so important, these companies need to be well capitalized at the start so that they don't sort of run out of money before they even get to have that missing middle capital conversation.
Right, and we're talking about the recent article of yours in MIT Technology Review.
Yeah.
One of the other things you mentioned there, which was really interesting, was by outsourcing manufacturing to China, we've effectively lost a generation of people who would be learning on the job and developing skills. And now if we want to try and cut ourselves out of the Chinese supply chain, we don't actually have the people with that knowledge and skill. Given that there's now effectively a war on, how do we deal with that quickly?
So I think what we've recognized is that in particular places in the world, we've got incredibly good, we've got the skills and knowledge and experience to do, again, that early stage invention, innovation. But we've allowed some other part of the world to go down those learning curves, to build up that tacit knowledge, whether that be in China and Shenzhen for drones or elsewhere. I think what we have to do, we've seen in Ukraine that we can actually spin up our industrial base quite quickly if we have to. It's not capital efficient. It's sort of quite haphazard. We're not getting the learning. But I think what that tells us is that if we don't just think about this in a narrow, could we do this in the US, could we do this in the UK? If we think across the alliance, there are going to be partners and places where we can do that quickly. And I would look to Ukraine. I'd also look to places like Poland, where you have a different labor market structure, but it will require concerted effort. And the other thing I would say is that we want to make sure we don't have history repeat itself. So let's make sure that we build out the production infrastructure, the supply chains, the critical inputs for the next generation of really strategic technologies like quantum computing, quantum sensing, fusion energy systems. We ought not to be caught on the back foot finding that absolutely key inputs come from somewhere else. Because if you make a mistake once, that's fine. But if you do it twice, then you're just stupid.
So we're drifting into ecosystems, which is your specialist topic.
It is. Yeah.
My first thoughts on what you just said is whose job is it to do that? Is this policy? Is it government? Is it private capital?
So given that we believe that resilience is important, if governments collectively have decided that being resilient because of the current geopolitical situation is absolutely essential, then I actually think it is the role of a government to lay down the architecture of policy to say that that matters. And that policy architecture, I think, starts with describing what matters to us, sending those signals into the economy, pricing resilience, so we ought to pay more for things that have, lithium or gallium or critical minerals that come from countries that we think won't hold us up. We have to send those signals through our industrial base to say that we care where things are produced. So those are the sorts of architectures the government has to put in place. And then the private sector can respond. And when there's market failures, we then have to sort of, I think, amplify the capital in these new kinds of ways and figure out where the frictions are. But I'd say it starts from the government putting into place the architecture that says that resilience matters and that is reflected in the signals that we send into the market. Because otherwise the market will say, sure, you say you want it, but when I give you a product that has a critical mineral produced in another way or that is more expensive because the supply chain is across allied nations, they don't want to buy it. They just say, no, we're doing low-cost purchasing.
So that resilience and the design of the ecosystem, and we were discussing this earlier, what scale do ecosystems need to be for defense and security and for this resilience? Are we talking cities, regions, nations, or are we actually really needing to build a single NATO ecosystem?
Sure. So the way that I think about ecosystems are quite geographically concentrated. So a lot of the work I've done is sort of saying, look, ecosystems happen in places around the world that have a real concentration of density, of talented people, of risk capital, of quite specialized infrastructure, and often quite sophisticated customers. And the mental model I think we have is somewhere like Silicon Valley, somewhere like Greater Boston. In the UK, I'd say it is sort of, there's a golden triangle ecosystem, and of course with George sitting there, I'd say that Milton Keynes is surely right at the core of the golden triangle with HMGCC. It's also all the work around telecoms and what have you up in the sort of Glasgow, Edinburgh belt. So that definition says it's typically regional. Obviously in a place like Estonia, it's a country, but that's just because some countries are smaller than others. And those typically work on having a comparative advantage. I mean, that's the thing that I think we all learn on the second day of economics class, is that comparative advantage is what allows one place to do something better than another, and that's efficient. I don't think the construct of an ecosystem works across NATO. What we can get, I think, and have, are a set of interconnected ecosystems which have deep specialization, some in the early stages of invention around things like quantum computing and other things, and others in later stage production capacity and so on. And it's really about reducing the frictions amongst them that I think is what's going to be the trick here. Because at the moment we have enormous numbers of frictions, both across European ecosystems, including the UK, and in particular, I think everyone recognizes across the Atlantic. I mean, whether it's things like CFIUS or ITAR restrictions and so on, it's really complicated when we need these companies in the ecosystem to actually tap into big markets. Very difficult at the moment.
So we're not a big market, we're lots of smaller markets.
Yeah, lots of very small markets.
Competing with big markets.
Correct.
And as I said to you, one of my friends critiqued Diana when it was launched because he said when companies come out of this program, they're then going to be trying to get through 27 procurement processes.
That's right.
So you're talking about these frictions. It's okay to have internal competition across the market, but it's got to be easy to move across it.
That's right. I mean, look, if I'm a startup company, Diana, which for those of you who don't know, is the Defence Innovation Accelerator of the North Atlantic, which is the sort of cousin organization to the NATO Innovation Fund, which is an investment fund, really is trying to lay down some of those challenges, the kind of challenges that in the UK DASA puts forward or HMGCC, but they're challenges that NATO countries think are important. Countries can participate anywhere, but for those countries to be successful, they've got to sell, right? Nobody's going to invest in a country that can't sell anything. If I had to literally do the same amount of effort to sell the first time into Estonia as I did the first time into Germany and then the UK and so on, and I reached a roadblock in the North Atlantic, none of these countries, these companies will be successful. So I think what we need to think carefully about is what are the pathways for adoption? How can we make it the case that if something's been adopted in one NATO country, then it doesn't necessarily have to be recompeted in another, that the evidence I generate in the field in Ukraine or in some other context actually is relevant. It's very much like medical devices or drugs. Right? I don't actually have to retest a medicine in every single European country separately from scratch. I don't have to prove to you that Ozempic works on Estonians and on the Poles and on the Brits, right? That evidence carries with it. And the question is, can we do something like that to reduce the friction?
So the question is it working yet?
Is it working? Oh, you mean not is the product
working?
Well,
actually, from a NIF perspective,
yes.
I mean, you see investments going into defense and security companies, dual-use
That's what
companies.
we're doing. Yes.
Are they able to move through the NATO marketplace easily yet, or is it not working?
I think there are still very, very significant frictions. I mean, we have made, I think, half a dozen investments that are currently public and have been announced in some really exciting companies in Germany and Lithuania and the UK. And each of those companies is really making some important initial steps into selling and procurement. ARX, which is a small autonomous vehicle company in Germany, is doing that. ISAR, which is space launch, Space Forge in the UK, Samarasense. They're all beginning that journey. But there's nothing that makes me think that it's going to be easy for them. We've got an entire team that we're building. We heard John Ridge in the earlier session, who's going to be joining our team to do this with us. But the countries are willing, but we've got to think about these efficient pathways. Is Estonia the right place to begin because they are efficient at these kinds of things? Then can the UK be a place where people do things at a reasonable scale? And how do we cross the Atlantic? I mean, we can't pretend that companies can be successful in many instances without tapping into the huge US market, and there's got to be a way in which that's done efficiently.
And we're talking about Estonia because the Estonian ambassador here is watching us. So, but when I was there,
I didn't know that,
we've got George and Vilja. What struck me is the pace. The pace, obviously, in Ukraine because they are at war. The pace in Estonia because they're really supporting Ukraine and because they feel they're 2.5 hours from Russia.
Yeah.
That pace and energy, I don't feel it here, and I don't feel it in other Western bits of NATO. One of the questions that I've been sort of seeding throughout this conference is, things change when you're at war.
Absolutely.
Our governments haven't chosen to say we're at war, but I think most people I've talked to around the conference agree that we are at war, or war is with us.
Yes.
At what point do we have to be at war for all of that slowness to change within NATO and have the same energy you sort of feel in places like Ukraine and Estonia?
Yeah. I mean, look, we've absolutely seen when Estonia is at war, you see an absolute transformation. I mean, it's not as if the Ukrainian industrial base looked as pacey, innovative, energetic before. It didn't look like that even after the invasion of Crimea. But there was this sort of shift and transformation, a sense of urgency. I think, and you and I both spent time understanding what's happened in Estonia. I met the Estonian Prime Minister a few years ago, there was a sense that perhaps Estonia wasn't at war, but it was in a place of both potential conflict and a country that said, we are going to do interesting things by being better able to move at pace. So I think we have to have a sense of both. We are in a geopolitical crisis, I think. How do we create that sense of urgency that allows us to move away the bureaucracy that is unnecessary while maintaining the focus on sort of safety and some of those other issues that we know matter. We saw the same with COVID, right? We were able to put a vaccine through an assessment, right, and trials in a very rapid period of time. And so we know it can be done. I think it's extremely hard to replicate being at war, but I think we ought to be able to send a message that we are in a state of sufficient geopolitical crisis that we actually need to act now. And I don't think we have really any time to waste.
And it neatly just brings to one last thing I was hoping we'd have time for, because I think it is related to that, is your use of the phrase cannibalization. Can you explain that a bit? Because I think the way startups have stepped up in Ukraine and obviously in Estonia and elsewhere, solving problems very quickly, cannibalizing. Do you want to just tell us a bit about cannibalization and how that can be an obstacle to this sort of pace?
Well, look, I mean, I think in most, when you think about what gets taught in business schools and what have you, you talk about sort of cannibalizing markets and the big incumbents. And so you obviously have frictions that are put in place by those who are the incumbents in the system. And so the startup companies have to not only do their work, but they have to overcome those sort of incumbents. Now, I think in many instances, when things are urgent, all those barriers are just moved to one side. I think the position we're going to end up with, particularly in defense and security markets, will be, and I think we heard this a little on the earlier panel, will be there will continue to be primes producing very large systems. They're not going to be cannibalized, but they do need to create an interface where, and they need to be required to create interfaces where startups can work effectively with them. They need to be able to make sure that we have the design of parts so that we can actually produce them on an aircraft carrier when we need them, and so on. And so I think we're going to live in a state of sort of what some people call co-opetition, right? We're going to cooperate and compete. We'll end up, I think, with the next generation of digital primes, and I think we need to end up with a very rich ecosystem of startups. And so it'll be this combination. I don't think we're going to end up in a system of sort of VHS versus Betamax, or video recorders being displaced by CDs and Netflix having to go completely online and nobody even knowing. None of our children know what a DVD is. They think that's our grandparents' technology. I think we have to live in this co-opetition kind of state. But that's very beholden on ministries of defense, the national security community, actually understanding these market dynamics and knowing when to open up interfaces and when to require competition.
2 minutes left, and you asked me to ask you, what is there to feel optimistic about? What do you feel optimistic about?
I'm not sure I did ask you to ask me that,
okay,
but okay. What is there? Look, I actually think the fact that you have been able to organize this conference in reasonably short order, gather all kinds of individuals together. I mean, I feel as if I'm both among friends, many people in this room I know quite well, many of you I've heard of, even if I've never met you, and lots of new people to meet, is the fact that this community is gathering on this side of the Atlantic gives me incredible hope. There are gatherings like this in the US. I'll say that I think when we do it here, it's quite special. We somehow are able to bring the history of the Royal Artillery Company to bear on this and remind ourselves that actually technology matters. I mean, having supremacy in artillery turned out to be a useful thing. So I'm incredibly optimistic about that. I'm optimistic when I stand in my classroom and 5 years ago, I wouldn't have talked about defense and security. It wouldn't have been seen as interesting. I wouldn't necessarily have talked about the interesting problem sets that our national security community, our defense community, our first responder communities have. Nobody would have particularly paid attention. Now they do. I'm optimistic with the fact that those individuals who care deeply about net zero and ESG now don't see defense and security as a pariah, but actually as a prerequisite for those things. So those three things, particularly with this next generation, give me a huge sense of optimism, as does their sense of impatience, because they're used to sort of swiping around their phone and having things happen quickly. I think they are going to put that sense of urgency on us, and I don't think any of us want to be the generation that says, we dropped the ball and we weren't urgent enough, we didn't talk about the geopolitical crisis, and we didn't adapt our systems quickly enough.
Brilliant. Great point to end on. Thank you very much. Sorry
Thank
we
you
didn't have
very
longer,
much.
but it's fabulous to have you here.